I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma. I take refuge in the Sangha. Happy warm summer day, everybody. I'd like to start out today by talking a little bit about lotus flowers. They're a very interesting flower, and they're seen often in Buddhist iconography. In fact, the Buddha, as you come up the stairs out in the hall, is sitting in the middle of a big lotus flower. They're really interesting flowers. The roots of the flower are in the mud. They live in shallow ponds, and they're embedded in the mud, and then a very thick stalk grows up through the water, sometimes up to 4 feet in depth, and a flower blooms at the top. The flowers can be big, like 8 inches in diameter, and the leaves can spread out on the top of the water up to 8 feet. So they're this very sturdy water flower rooted in the mud. Sometimes they bloom under the water, even some of them, but others make it up through the water on this thick stalk and bloom maybe 3 or 4 inches above the water. The texture of them is such that the silt and sand of the water that they're coming up through doesn't stick to them. So when they come up and bloom, they look beautifully clean. They open up each day when the sun is shining on them, and then they close up again at the end of the day. All the parts of the plants are used. I think the seeds can be ground up for tea, and the older, bigger leaves are used to wrap up food. And even the woody stalk, the long fibers, can be harvested and woven and made into cloth, lotus cloth. In Buddhist iconography, the lotus stands for this, chance of enlightenment from being caught in confusion and delusion in the mud and quagmires of life, and something in us knowing that there is more, that's searching for this light and growing up and then emerging into clarity. So I've been often thought about this because I've often felt in the muddy quagmire. It's like, how is it that I'm ever going to find my way out of this confusion and delusion? Is it really going to happen for me that I'm going to have clarity and wisdom? How do you get from here to there? That's a great question, and it's one that the Buddha asked himself. And his first talk after his enlightenment, his first teaching was on that topic. The Eightfold Path is the way to get from this confusion and delusion, this suffering that we get caught in, to the light, to enlightenment. So 2,600, 2,500 years ago, the Buddha and his followers were living a life that was an embodiment of this Eightfold Path. They lived a life where they didn't deal with money and possessions. They begged for food so that they could keep their minds on practice and follow the teachings that are embedded in the Eightfold Path. So biggest picture, we're advised to look at 3 areas. One is to begin with to live an ethical life, to give a foundation of calmness and stability to this search, to this effort that we're going to put into seeing life as it is. To be mindful and to practice meditation, concentration, because we have to change the very structure of our mind to get from this muddy confusion into the clarity of sunlight. It can't just happen automatically. We have to change. And then to really learn to see the world as it is. So we have this confusion that things are solid and fixed, but the reality is that they are fluid and flowing, and we are fluid and flowing. And it's so counterintuitive, so we have to learn to shift our point of view. Buddhism, each culture that it meets brings something different to it. So Buddhism first was in India, and then it went to China, and from China to Japan, and our particular style of Buddhism that we practice here came from Japan. And it changed the emphasis a little bit, but also time went on. So now we find ourselves in 2024, living in Portland, Oregon, living with all of the daily concerns that we have here and now. And the question is this path that was laid out by the Buddha for his followers then, is there some tweaking that could be done to it that might be helpful for us now, too, given our nature and how we interact and how society is today? So this was a question that was on the minds of the teachers of this community. About a month ago, we met at the monastery and talked about paths of practice, how to get from the mud to the sunlight. Knowing the Eightfold Path is just so beneficial because embedded in it are so many useful practices, a life's worth of useful practices. And also, it gives a big picture of what the Buddha was trying to teach. But it's also beneficial to know from people who have been practicing for many years now in this time what they see as helpful. So when we started out this meeting at the monastery a month or so ago, people shared how many years they've been practicing. And there were Chosen and Hogan, our teachers, have both been practicing more than 50 years. And there were others, Fuho, who leads the Sunday morning, had been practicing for 40 years. There were others at 30, Gensho at 20. So there was years of experience there. And it was really interesting to hear what that group of people learned was helpful in getting us further along towards this clarity, towards a life that's more joyful and less suffering, less concerned with me and mine. So I thought I'd go over a couple of the different approaches that we talked about, kind of interesting. One way to think about paths of practice is, it reminds me of like a target with a bullseye in the middle, and then a ring, and then a bigger ring. And the center ring is like this, that's I, me, mine, I am separate from the world, and I am a complete individual. We call this the 3 paths or circles model. And the first job of practice is to learn to stabilize the heart and mind, and to start to open up to this life and not feel so confined and convinced and alone. Sometimes this is said going from me to we. And there are practices that are associated with this stage of practice, like starting a meditation practice and even bringing that home. So having a night that you come to the temple, that you practice regularly, and then having a home practice, maybe just 10 minutes a day, but something regularly helps to start that shift of me to this is a bigger world. And then these paths of practice were framed within the offerings that we have here. So things that you can do at the beginning of practice to start moving you along, to get from that center constricted circle out to the next ring. And that includes taking classes, mindful consumption of materials, of food, of media, practices to develop concentration and calmness, like loving kindness practice or breath practice. And then as people begin to settle and the practices start shifting, how they feel, then they can move on to this middle circle, which is, in this model, is taking refuge in entering the bodhisattva path. This is starting to think in terms of what can I do to be of service to others. And this is said really nicely. As our life stabilizes and our inner life becomes more conscious, calm, and balanced, we become curious about the teachings that underlie the benefit that we have experienced. No longer tossed around by afflictive emotions and unconscious beliefs, we wish to further clarify the mind and develop an open and kind heart. And the kinds of classes that start helping that we offer here is starting to sit for longer periods of time, maybe the weekend classes or weekend meditation retreats, or even week-long retreats at the monastery, the mindful eating classes, the classes on the inner critic, these kinds of things that start to loosen the grip of that selfishness that we all have. And then the last part of this particular model, you could think of it like that big circle, the enso, is the encompassing everything, our Buddha nature, and really beginning to realize that there isn't a separation between all of you and me. It's all one big, inclusive life. Working with a teacher, sitting more sesshin, deeply studying some of the text, all of those things can be helpful in that progression. Another way we looked at it was a much more linear approach. This is more, in the beginning, you are really becoming a meditator, really learning how to concentrate, starting to remove some of the impediments that come up over and over again, like that critical mind, or working with some habits that you may have that are really unhelpful, like lying or stealing or being unkind, getting angry, really looking at some of those things that are in the way of your spiritual life. And then, so setting up healthy practices and really looking at what's unhealthy. And then there's, taking the precepts, beginner's mind retreats. There's a whole list of things that are going to be helpful when you're thinking in a more linear way like that. And that in this model, that's the first years, 1, 2, 3 years. And then as you start to settle in, then the intermediate levels, 3 to 7 years, you start, again, there's a lot of overlap here, but going to longer retreats, developing stronger relationships with your teachers, commit to becoming a Buddhist by studying the precepts and really committing to a higher level of ethical living, taking advantage of some of the longer, more intensive classes that are offered here, and maybe getting involved in the organization as a whole, maybe going to board meetings or seeing how, volunteering in on one of the evenings in one of the service positions. And then the last level for senior students in this linear model is offering your skills to the community and really reaching out and becoming part of the community and being helpful to other people as they're coming in. So these models, some of this one may resonate more than the other. It can be very helpful at the beginning, just kind of as a roadmap of what am I doing and where the heck am I going and where's this end, right? On the one hand, it can be helpful, but on the other hand, it can be harmful. If you start thinking in terms of, I'm already in year 3 and I haven't even done any of that list, and like I'm a bad Zen person now, right? That we have to be careful. If you're so fixated on the roadmap, you don't look up and see where you're driving. How helpful is the map, right? So again, the middle way is something to keep in mind and to realize that these things are tools. I think of like, a child learning to walk. They start out not being able to roll over, then they can roll over, they may start to come onto their hands and knees, then maybe standing up, grabbing onto something, and then taking a few steps, and then they're off running and playing. That happened quite naturally. That child did not have to check Your Child from 0 to 6 book written by a pediatrician, right? And I think we need to also have some faith that our unique path, our unique development, our spiritual path is organic within us as well. And it may not follow one of these prescribed courses. It can be helpful, and it can be helpful, very helpful, to work with a teacher who has the overview. But it's also helpful to realize that this is an organic process, just as a child grows or spiritual development in a person. It's the lotus flower seeking the light. It doesn't need to know what's in the book. That being said, this document is downstairs if you want to take a closer look at it. There is just as we walk in the door, when we make a circle, there's a little display area and it has some documents in it. And you can take a look at this path of practice document, it can be good to look at it and realize, oh, look at, I really got myself doing only this one area, and there's this whole other area of development that might be interesting to explore. So it might help balance you out a little bit. It might encourage you to work more closely with one of our teachers here, or to be open to different ways of practice. May your practice go well.